Today is June the 20th, 2009, and thank you, Bob, for being able to join us today and share your memories about life here in the agricultural community of Carroll County. So tell me, what brought you to Carroll County?
Well, I was with the University of Maryland Cooperative Extension Service. I was currently in Dorchester County as an associate county agent after graduate school at the university, and they gave me the opportunity to come to Carroll County. And Carroll County's always had the reputation of being a great agricultural county, and so I jumped at the opportunity to come here and participate in the agricultural endeavors that farmers were involved in at that time.
Did you come from a farm background yourself?
Yes, I was born and raised on a dairy farm in Harford County. My two brothers were continued in farming. Two of us, the oldest and I'm the youngest, we left the farm. He was an engineer and I pursued agriculture. I figured if I couldn't farm with the family farm that I ought to do something in agriculture, and this was the closest thing to farming that I could think of.
And your whole family came with you when you came to Carroll County?
Well, it was just my wife at the time. Actually, our first child was born 30 days after we came to Carroll County.
Good planning.
Yeah.
Wanted to talk a little bit about the changes that you have seen in the agricultural community from your position with the Cooperative Extension. Let's start with maybe the equipment, you know, the horses and farm machinery and such.
Well, actually, after the war, World War II, and then the Korean War, when I got here, people were really beginning to get into gear with many of the changes that couldn't take place during the war. Machinery, buildings, the explosion of milking pollers, of improved equipment, really was beginning to blossom at the time that I came. Horses were still used in some cases, but not very many. Tractors, rubber-tarred machinery, combines, and all that came pretty rapidly after the war, but wasn't as available and wasn't as advanced technically.
Yeah, when you talk about a dairy parlor, did that mean the farmer wasn't manually milking each animal? There was a...
Well, they began to use milking machines actually in the late 30s and 40s, but milking pollers where the cows were in loose housing, they had the freedom to walk around under what we called a loafing shed, and then they went in through the milking poller just to be milked. The only time they spent in the poller was just the time they were being milked, and you could milk many more cows per hour, so it enabled the farmer to keep more cows, and then in the 60s begin to really specialize in, if they were going to be dairy farmers, they specialized in the dairy and the crop production that supported the dairy industry.
So other kinds of animals we think of as farm animals wouldn't be there? There wouldn't be chickens and pigs and...
Well, that was having chickens and pigs and maybe a few beef animals and hogs, along with dairy operation, was very common until after the war. And that's when a lot of that began to change, and people began to specialize, particularly in the 60s. You couldn't afford to be good in all that animal production. And so consequently, they needed to be beef feeders, or they needed to be dairy farmers, or they needed to be poultry, and that gave rise to poultry houses that began, rather than having a 200 flock of chickens, they had maybe 2,000 chickens. And the largest poultry farmer today in Carroll County I think has 500,000 layers. So that's how we've gone from 30, 40, 200 chickens to specialization.
My God.
By the same token, the largest dairy farm in Carroll County is probably 700 or 800 cows.
100.
And so they're specialists.
Yeah.
They have to be specialists in their field.
How many people lived in Carroll County when you first moved here?
The census when I came here was about 53,000 people.
Do you have an idea of what it is today?
Somewhere in the neighborhood of 190,000 people. That doesn't mean that we've lost all of our farmland, because we have an important land preservation, ag land preservation program of nearly 60,000 acres already preserved in a permanent way. The goal is 100,000 acres, but Carroll County is only a moderately sized county, 289,000 acres, and about 150,000 acres are still in farming. So even though we've seen an explosion in the population in Carroll County, we have a lot of agriculture still going in Carroll County.
Well, going back to the transition from animal management, plowing and such, to the transition into mechanized equipment, what were the brands? Was there a lot of resistance to it, do you think?
Oh no, not within the farming community, because they looked, as one farmer said when he had a breakdown in a piece of equipment, he said, "We've changed backache for headaches." It's always a headache to have a breakdown for farm equipment when you're right in the midst of combining grain or baling hay. But that was really a good example, because a lot of the backbreaking jobs were eliminated with the advancement of farming equipment.
Can you remember some of the common brands or the dealerships that sold the brands?
Oh, International Harvester, John Deere, Alice Chalmers. Oliver was important when I came here, that later became the White Equipment Company. Massey Ferguson, which was an offspring of the Ford Ferguson, and the Ford Motor Company developed the Ford tractor that was very popular on a smaller tractor, but very popular back in the 40s and 50s.
And what was the breed of horse that it was replacing?
Well, the breed of horses were mainly Belgium and Percheron, although there were Clydesdales and other breeds of, and I'm talking strictly of draft horses. Yes. Draft horses are the workhorses
that pull the plows.
Pulled the plow, pulled the heavy machinery, and then there were also a lot of mules used. Mules are a cross between a mare, a female horse, and a jack. And a jack belongs to the donkey family. And mules always were known as tough work animals. So there were probably, I would imagine, maybe 50-50. 50% of the farms had mules, and 50% of the farms had horses.
Wow. Has there been much of a change in the size of the farms around?
Not a whole lot. Surprisingly, the size of the average farm in Carroll County now is about 135 acres, and that's been reduced from maybe a maximum of 150 or 60 acres. But when everything was done with horses, you probably had a lot of 60 and 70 acre farms. And then they transitioned up some but not nearly as great. We may have farmers that farm 1,000 acres of corn today, but land is too expensive for him to own that. So he owns his base, and he may own a 150-acre farm and farm 1,000 acres.
He rents that from someone else?
He rents that from other people. And there are a lot of people that have farmland that they can't, they work off the farm. It may be a farm that they inherited, or it may be a farm that is owned by a professional that has bought the farm, raised his family. Carroll County is a great place to raise a family, and you'll see that. And part of that is because of the, even today, the feeling towards the agricultural community and its importance. And I'm always pleased to know that there is a great deal of emphasis given to the farm community, because it's a vital part of the community, and it's what keeps a certain, I guess, prestige or historical feeling towards Carroll County.
Mm-hmm. We had talked about the evolution or the change in the equipment used to work the land, but weren't there also some important changes in the crops themselves, the seed crop and the kinds of things that were being grown?
Tremendous progress made in the genetic material in crops. Hybrid corn came into being in the 1930s. But hybrid corn and corn varieties, corn and soybean and alfalfa and timothy and clover, all those crops had a lot of breeding work done by the agricultural experiment stations, and also done by the commercial producers of various seed crops like Pioneer and DeKalb and
are those varieties you're mentioning?
They're companies.
Yes.
Those companies, many of those have translated into subsidiaries of larger corporations today, but they do a tremendous amount of research work.
And the research is towards what? More abundant production or disease resistance, or
quality, disease resistance, production, resisting drought, resisting wet, cold conditions. We have corn that will germinate in ground that's much colder than it used to do. That enables a farmer to plant corn in April here, and that was kind of an unheard of thing 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. You had to wait until the ground warmed up in order for the corn to germinate. If you planted corn too early, it would sit in the ground. If the ground was cold, and rot. So they had to replant their corn.
Expensive. Now
we have varieties that are early planted varieties that can get into the ground when the ground is 55 degrees.
Wow. Wow. Also, I think you mentioned that there's been a huge revolution in the techniques used to work the land. You mentioned no-till?
No-till came into being in 1960, in the late 60s.
Why was that?
It was an outgrowth of a farmer that experimented with no-till farming in Ohio in the 40s. Only problem is he didn't have any corn because the weeds grew faster than the corn. And it wasn't until weed pesticides came on the market, and many people are familiar with 2,4-D. That was one of the first ones, but we have advanced the pesticide management of weeds to the point where we can have clean fields, good yields, and that is the way that no-till farming entered into the picture.
And how does that work? Would you explain no-till?
Well, no-till is where
Compare the two.
You use pesticides to kill the existing weeds and herbage that's on the field at the time of planting, and then the planter does not disturb the soil. It has a little disc that drops the seed about 2 inches into the soil.
Ejects it.
And so it's literally an injection into the soil, and covers it with a little roller that presses it.
This is one pass through the field.
One pass through the field. And that gave rise to no-till corn. And the reason that was so important is because erosion control. In the rolling hills of Carroll County, erosion has always been a factor that farmers, good farmers, have had to work very carefully with over the years. But now with good conservation practices and no-till corn, you'll probably get 95% of the erosion control that you would have from alternating contour strips. Even though most farmers in Carroll County still plan on the contour. It's a good practice to go around the hill rather than up the hill.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned a little bit earlier that in describing no-till that you used pesticides to control what was going on in the land. Could you mention how that's become, what kind of a role that plays in farming today?
Well, it's a very important role. The proper use of pesticides is a very safe and research-backed practice that is safe to the food supply. It's safe to the farmer as long as he uses them safely. The most dangerous pesticides are those that kill insects, and so the trend towards being safe for a food supply sometimes has it's safe for the food but dangerous to the farmer. So the farmer has to be very careful in the kind of practices he uses, because after all, he not only is the recipient of some of that food supply right on his own farm for his farm family, and it's also to the applicator. And so they use very safe practices in doing this. Otherwise, there'd be a lot more health issues than there are on a farm.
Were you involved with county fairs and activities like that in the county?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Since I've been here in the county, the only fair that we have annually is the 4-H FFA fair. Mm-hmm. That's held annually the last part of July at the Ag Center. And that is one of the outstanding 4-H FFA youth fairs east of the Mississippi, with no midway and no entrance fee. People from over the country just can't imagine having a fair, but you know what? The people in Carroll County are so wonderful in their volunteer efforts. We have nearly 500 people that volunteer to work during the week of the fair. And old 4-Hers were always taught that if they gained from 4-H work, they also owed something to the people that came behind them. And we've had people take their vacations from their job off the farm to come back and work every year at the fair.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And it's the traditional, the youngsters are growing animals or doing farm-oriented, raising the animals, tracking the weight, recording the food.
Sure.
The traditional.
Beef and dairy projects, sheep projects and goats have grown tremendously in the last few years because it's an easy thing for and not much of an investment for a 4-H'er. And they get many of the same experiences with a 100-pound sheep as they would with a 1,400-pound cow. Mm-hmm. Not nearly as expensive or difficult to keep. And so that's been a wonderful experience for youngsters to work with that animal and teach them the responsibility, the nutrition, the health issues associated with the animal, the reproduction of the animals, bringing ewes or piglets into the world, or a newborn calf. That's a tremendous experience for farm families.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You had talked about the Indian residents and the Hashawa, how the Hashawa came to be a part of Carroll County. Could you fill us in on that, please?
Well, when the book Legacy of the Land was written, and some of the research that was done as a background, obviously it trended back to when the Indians inhabited Carroll County, and there were some large Indian tribes. Many of those were concentrated in the northern part of the county, Union Mills, Deep Run Road section, and the Shawnee Indians called that Hashawa, and Hashawa means old fields, and that's where the Hashawa Environmental Center that all the kids go to for outdoor school, that's where it got its name, was Hashawa, from the Indian tribes.
Yeah. I see you have a copy of that book. Would you like to show it to our viewers?
Yes, this is a copy of the Legacy of the Land, 250 years of agriculture in Carroll County. It was done as a result of the establishment of the Farm Museum back in 1965. People came into the county agent's office and would ask me what happened in 1880 or when tobacco was important. Tobacco, by the way, was the prime crop, prime money crop in Carroll County back in the late 1900s, along with wheat and flour. All the mills, Carroll County was famous for all the mills that were established, and the original establishment was the Owings brothers. Two Owings brothers went to Owings Mills. That's where it got its name, and they established a wheat flour mill.
And these were on the tributaries of the various rivers?
Tributaries of the various streams and rivers. Mm-hmm. We don't have rivers in Carroll County. All of them are just creeks, or springheads and streams. But they created a water overflow into a water-powered mill. Mm-hmm. And of course, the best example of that in Carroll County is Union Mills, mm-hmm. and the Union Mills Homestead.
Now, the author is Carol Lee, was published in 1982. You mentioned it was in cooperation with a gentleman from the Smithsonian. Is that correct?
That's correct, Dr. Terry Scherer. We found that when we got into the trying to bring together a history of Carroll County agriculture, that we couldn't really go by old wives' tales. We had to really get into some solid research. And Dr. Terry Scherer was in the Smithsonian as the associate historian. And fortunately for us, after graduating in history at the University of Maryland, he spent time as a youth on the Scherer farm in Hampstead. He actually grew up in Baltimore. So he was a willing partner in saying and helping with this book, and we owe a great deal to him. And Carol Lee was one of his graduate students from George Washington University, and she did most of the research for the book. And but intermingled, we didn't want to get rid of all the old tales about farming and how farming was, and so we have what we call inserts. About 75 of these are stories from Carroll County people that tell about various segments of the agricultural life. And I remember Dr. Bob McKinney, as a boy, helped bring cattle from the Union stockyards through the winding roads from Baltimore to Sykesville and Westminster. We didn't have trucks then to bring these cattle, so they drove cattle, or they were on the train. But in this case, a lot of the cattle that were brought into Carroll County to be fed for beef, and some of the dairy cattle were brought
Walked in.
Walked into Carroll County on hoof.
So if our readers would like to get a copy of the book, it's available at the library?
There's still some copies available at the Carroll County Farm Museum in their gift shop. And so if anybody's interested in the book, I think it's a wonderful book because it helps give the flavor of many of the actual farm producers at that time.
Now, you had also mentioned in passing about the Farm Museum. How did that come into being?
Well, that was known as the Alms House or the Poor Farm. That was the place that anybody that was homeless, didn't have shelter, or didn't have food or couldn't afford it, would go to the poor, what was commonly referred to as a poor farm. It was an operating farm. The women did food preparation and gardening and that sort of thing, and the men worked in the fields. They grew corn, they grew larger acreages of sweet corn and tomatoes and things that need to be preserved and canned for use at the museum. But that farm, the barn was built in 1856, 1855, and the house wasn't built until the following year. In 1965, the county commissioners, there were only 9 clients at the museum at the poor farm at that time, and it was thought that they could be better cared for at a lot less cost by dispensing them into the community to be in some needed what we call assisted living now. Some of them just needed a place to stay, and in some cases they were still useful in helping with chores and that sort of. So those 9 people were dispersed into the community, and the poor farm was closed down in 1965. Concurrent with that, they named it as the new Carroll County Farm Museum, because it had so many qualities that would lend itself to the establishment of the museum, and also it would provide open space for the city of area of Westminster, and I think everybody appreciates that open space. That
what possibilities were passed up in favor of keeping that as a farm demonstration point?
Oh, there were lots of uses that people wanted to make of it, including turning it into housing that would be close by, and they had water and sewerage and that sort of thing. Schools, it was suggested that I think 1 or 2 or more schools could be located there. The Ag Center had been established in 1954, and so it was 13 acres that had been taken off of the county farm that had been purchased by the Ag Center. And it just seemed like a natural that the Farm Museum would be a wonderful place that could reflect the agricultural history of Carroll County over the years. And It continues today to be a very important place and an interesting place to visit. And most of the people going through the museum today have no background in farming. I used to speak at service clubs, and I'd ask people at a Rotary Club or Kiwanis Club or Lions Club, how many of you in here had some experience on a farm? We'd maybe get 60 or 70% of the people back in the 60s that would say, I spent time, or I was born and raised on a farm. I went to the Junior Chamber of Commerce that same year. 15% of those people. And it seemed important to me that, and I think that supported the importance of establishing something to be preserved of Carroll County's historical perspective.
Tradition, that important tradition. We had talked about, you had developed something of a timeline of what you had observed and experienced as the farming revolution, if you will, from animal, plowing with animals and stuff. Can you kind of capstone or highlight some of those timeline, those benchmarks that you identified?
Yeah, the dairy industry, as a result of artificial breeding, milk production, milking parlors came into being beginning in the 50s. In the 60s, we saw weed control, pesticide management, diseases of small grain, improved hybrids. Land use became a part of the agricultural community beginning in the 60s. We had our first director of planning actually appointed in 1959, George Greer. George came from Harford County and had a farm background and was always very sympathetic to our community, making sure that it had adequate protection, the ability to farm without having complaining neighbors who might have just moved in from Baltimore. And I think that has continued, that neighbors today, even though they have a non-agricultural background, they are very, well, they delight in being sprinkled through the agricultural community. And there's been a good relationship between farmers and their neighbors for the most part. We saw specialization beginning to occur in the 60s. The dairy herds, being a beef producer, being a crop producer. The crops mainly corn, wheat, barley, and hay crops. But in the 1980s, with the advancement of pesticides, then soybeans. I retired in 1984, and there were about 1,000 acres of soybeans in Carroll County. I'm not sure the acreage today, but I think it would be around 35,000 acres of soybeans that are grown in Carroll County today. And a crop farmer is likely to be, some of them with wheat, not nearly as important as it once was, but wheat, corn, and soybeans. And hay crops have become more important because of the horse industry. And the horse industry has increased a good deal, mainly not from breeders, but from standpoint of people having 3 or 4 horses.
Pleasure riding?
Pleasure riding horses. The outgrowth of the pleasure horse was the therapeutic riding program that was introduced in the 4-H program by Bob Shirley, who was then a 4-H extension agent in Carroll County. We saw new regulations, pesticide regulations, regulations in land use, water quality concerns.
Have these been helpful, do you think?
What's that?
Have these been helpful?
Yes, I think they have. It's added to good farming practices, and the thing that is a concern in the farm community today is to have too stringent regulations that would adversely affect food production. Most people don't give proper consideration to background environmental problems that is nature's way. After all, the Grand Canyon was not built by farmers upstream plowing their fields. That was nature's use of the environment, and nature can be pretty ravaging sometimes, both to crop production, soils. We had a research project in Baltimore County that took a square mile of virgin woodland, had never been cut. And in a year's time, they had 17 tons of mineral and runoff from that wood. 17 tons at a square mile. Now, that's nature. Nature contributed 17 tons in a woodland. Well, we can't get our food supply from woodland. And so when you open up fields and soils and expose them to the elements, and you have gully washers, but for the most part, you go through Carroll County today and you don't see very many gullies in fields. You have grass waterways. Farmers have done a wonderful job of contouring, working around it. After all, it's much easier on gas consumption or diesel consumption in a tractor if you're going around the hill than if you're going up and down the hill.
Yeah.
And so that contributes to the efficiency of farming.
Well, you had talked, have you finished your timeline? I didn't mean to.
Well, public issues then became a very important thing in the 70s, giving rise to water quality, conservation, Chesapeake Bay interests. So all those kind of public issues have come into play since about 1970.
So looking ahead, what do you think the future is for the agricultural community here in Carroll County? What are your hopes for it?
Well, my hope is that we would reach the goal of 100,000 acres of permanently preserved farmland. This provides free open space, and I think it's also important to remember that crop production is also good for the, we hear so much about the CO2, oxygen levels. Trees and alfalfa and corn breathe in carbon dioxide, otherwise carbohydrates could not be produced from the photosynthetic process in plants. And it's probably a surprise to people, but one of the limiting factors in corn production is carbon dioxide in the summertime. Corn requires so much, it grows so rapidly in the hot summer months. If you have adequate moisture and fertilizer, corn grows so rapidly that if you take carbon dioxide and blow it through the rows of corn, you could increase it as much as 10 to 20%, the production. And people don't give any thought to that sort of thing. Farming adds quality to our environment as well as trees. Every alfalfa plant, every corn plant, every soybean plant has to breathe in carbon dioxide, and they give off oxygen to us. And so that's a very important air quality.
Have you seen much of a change in the character of the farmers working the land?
They've become highly technical, computer savvy, of which I don't have. See, that almost bypassed me in the computer world. Information that's available on the websites, instant review of some research that was done in California or Indiana or Alabama, having to be careful because what applies to fertility in Illinois does not apply here. They have high residual organic material in the soil. We do not in the soils that are here in the East Coast. So fertilizer recommendations have to be different. We use much less phosphorus than they have to use because phosphorus gets tied up into organic matter. So it's a technical, scientific agriculture that we're living in. And I've never met a dumb farmer. Sometimes they call themselves a dumb farmer. I've never met one because they're highly creative and ingenious in their use of knowledge. I've always considered an educated person as using knowledge intelligently. And you find very few farmers that don't have a reservoir of information in their mind. And you see, historically, they've always known the art of farming. It's the science of farming that is so important in today's arena.
Do you think a family farmer can compete against the large commercial farms?
Oh, more so. More so. Do it more economically. Labor is a big thing in farming even today. Properly skilled labor that knows how to use that particular piece of equipment safely and efficiently. So farm families are still important. A 100-cow farm is generally considered to be a two-person farm. It's very difficult for the farm to utilize only his family so that 100-acre farm may be a 200-cow farm and have at least one or two employees, because now farm families need and deserve some time off every week rather than working. Cows have to be milked 7 days a week. And so that's an important, wherever there are animals. Chickens have to be attended to 7 days a week. Beef cattle, sheep, goats, all the animals have to be attended to. Much more mechanization, easier to do, but it still has to be looked after. And observation for injuries, disease, whatever the issue might be in the healthy environment for animals has to be cared for.
Well, if you had any advice for someone who was contemplating moving into Carroll County, what would that advice be?
Well, if they were going to go into the farming enterprise, learn as much as you can about farming. Farming is a business, and anybody that goes into farming, you can do a garden with the feeling of just loving it. It's important to love farming, but it's important to learn the business aspect of farming because of regulations, because of bookkeeping, because of tax consequences, of almost everything they do has a consequence, either good or bad. and you sure don't want the bad consequences in the farming, or there goes your profit for the year. Crop insurance has become almost as important as fire insurance in a farm today, because you can have a perfect field of corn and have a 10-minute hailstorm in August and ruin maybe the whole crop, or 60 or 70% of the crop. We've had a lot of rain this year in 2009, but if the water spigot turns off about the 15th of July through the 15th of August, our corn crops will be very diminished, because that's the most important time when the corn comes out in tassel and the ears begin to be formed. That's the highest water requirement for the corn plant. And if we don't have corn then, and we had a drought in 1965, 66, and 67. 1 year's drought is hard on the farmer. 2-year drought is hard on everybody, because the water supply in Westminster got down to 27 days in 1967.
Wow.
And how do you provide water for a population of Westminster if you run out?
Yes. Yeah. Well, let me say thank you very much, Bob Jones, for joining us today. We very much appreciate so many of these rich and wonderful memories of the agricultural community here in Carroll County, and appreciate your time today. Thank you so very much.
Well, it's been a privilege to be here, talk about my favorite subject, the people in the farm community and the farming of Carroll County.